My husband Connor and his business partners thought it would be hilarious to abandon me at a rundown hotel in the Italian countryside after I questioned their business meeting. Let's see how the princess handles herself without Daddy's credit. Cards! Alan laughed as they drove away in our rental Mercedes. What they didn't know was that I'd end up owning that very hotel and discovering the illegal offshore accounts that would land all three of them in Italian prison. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Standing in the dusty parking lot of Hotel Villa Serena, watching the taillights disappear around the winding mountain road, I felt the familiar knot of humiliation twist in my stomach. This wasn't the first time Connor had used public embarrassment as a weapon, but it was certainly the most extreme. The medieval stone building loomed behind me, its weathered facade and broken shutters a stark contrast to the five-star resorts we usually frequented during our European business trips. The argument had started innocently enough. We'd been driving through the Tuscan hills for what Connor claimed was a scenic detour to meet his partners Alan and Clark at this remote location. As a former investment analyst who'd given up my career to support Connor's expanding tech consulting firm, I'd learned to read the signs of his increasingly secretive business dealings. When I'd casually asked why they needed to meet at such an isolated hotel instead of their usual Milan offices, Connor's jaw had tightened in that familiar way that warned me I'd crossed an invisible line. "Why can't you just enjoy the ride without analyzing everything, Eva?" He'd snapped, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. This is exactly why Alan says wives shouldn't come on business trips. You turn everything into an interrogation. I should have stayed quiet. After 8 years of marriage, I'd learned that questioning Connor's business decisions was the fastest way to trigger his volatile temper. But something about this trip felt different. The secretive phone calls conducted in hushed Italian, the way Alan and Clark had insisted on this specific location, the nervous energy that had radiated from all three men during our flight from Boston. My analytical mind, the one Connor claimed to love but constantly demanded I silence, couldn't stop cataloging the inconsistencies. When we'd pulled into the hotel's gravel parking lot, Alan and Clark were already waiting by their rented Audi, designer suits looking absurdly out of place against the rustic backdrop. The three men had immediately huddled together, speaking in low voices while gesturing toward the hotel's entrance. I'd watched from the car, noting the way they kept glancing toward the building's upper floors, toward windows that appeared to be boarded up. "Why don't you grab us some coffee from that little cafe we passed?" Connor had suggested when I'd approached their circle. It wasn't really a suggestion. The dismissive tone and pointed look made it clear I was being sent away. The adults need to discuss some complicated financial matters. The condescension had finally shattered my carefully maintained composure. "I have an MBA from Wharton, Connor. I think I can handle whatever complicated discussion you're having about what appears to be an abandoned hotel in the middle of nowhere." The silence that followed was deafening. Alan and Clark had exchanged glances while Connor's face had cycled through surprise, anger, and finally cold calculation. In that moment, I'd seen something in his eyes I'd never noticed before. Not just irritation at being questioned, but genuine fear. Fear of what I might understand if I stayed and listened. "You know what, Eva?" Connor had said, his voice taking on the artificially calm tone he used when he was about to do something particularly cruel. "You're absolutely right. You're so smart, so capable. Why don't you prove it? Alan, Clark, let's go handle our business. Eva can figure out her own way back to the hotel in Florence." I'd laughed, certain he was joking. "Connor, that's 40 miles through mountain roads. I don't even have the car keys." "Then I guess you'll need to get creative," Alan had chimed in, clearly enjoying the show. "Maybe this will teach you not to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." The three men had climbed into Connor's Mercedes, leaving me standing in disbelief as the engine roared to life. Through the windshield, I could see Connor's lips moving as he said something that made Alan and Clark burst into laughter. Then they were gone, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of their amusement hanging in. The mountain air. Now, standing alone in the gathering dusk, the reality of my situation began to sink in. My phone showed no signal. We were too remote, too high in the hills for reliable coverage. The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent behind the cypress trees that lined the property, and I could feel the temperature starting to drop. My designer heels and lightweight dress, perfect for a romantic dinner in Florence, were woefully inadequate for a mountain hike. The Hotel Villa Serena looked like it had seen better days, probably several decades ago. Paint peeled from the wooden shutters, and weeds pushed through cracks in the stone steps leading to the main entrance. A rusted sign hung at an angle from a single chain, creaking softly in the evening breeze. Yet, despite its neglected appearance, something about the building called to me. Maybe it was the elegant lines of its architecture, or the way the setting sun cast golden light across its weathered walls. But I found myself walking toward the entrance instead of down the mountain road. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, revealing a dimly lit lobby beyond. As I pushed it open, the hinges protested with a groan that echoed through the space. The interior was a fascinating contradiction. Beautiful bones overlaid with years of neglect. A grand staircase curved upward toward the second floor, its banister carved from what appeared to be local walnut. Faded frescoes decorated the walls, and though I couldn't make out all the details in the dim light, I could see enough to recognize the quality of the original craftsmanship. Ciao? Cha? Qualcuno! A voice called from somewhere deeper in the hotel. An elderly woman emerged from what appeared to be a small office behind the reception desk, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark eyes sharp with intelligence despite her obvious age. "I'm sorry, I don't speak much Italian. I began, then switched to my college French, hoping it might bridge the gap. Parlez-vous français? Her face lit up with understanding. Ah, oui, un peu. You are lost, no? American? Relief flooded through me as I nodded. Yes, American. My companions left me here. I need to find a way back to Florence. The woman, who introduced herself as Sophia Benedetti, the hotel's caretaker, studied my face with the kind of understanding that suggested she'd seen her share of abandoned women over the years. Without asking for details, she led me to a small sitting area near the reception desk and produced a bottle of wine and 2 glasses from behind the counter. "First, we drink," she said in her careful English, pouring generous portions of what turned out to be an excellent Chianti. "Then we talk about what brings a beautiful American woman to my mountain alone, with tears in her eyes and anger in her heart." As the wine loosened my tongue and Sophia's gentle questions drew out my story, I found myself explaining not just the evening's abandonment, but the years of subtle diminishment that had led to this moment. Connor's gradual erosion of my confidence, his dismissal of my professional expertise, the way he'd slowly isolated me from friends and family who might question his treatment of me. But it was when I mentioned the men's strange behavior around the hotel, their secretive discussions and nervous energy, that Sophia's expression sharpened with interest. "These men," she said carefully, refilling our glasses. "They have been here before, no. Many times, in the past year. Always very, how you say, careful. Always asking about the upper floors, about the rooms that are locked." A chill ran down, my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the old windows. "What's on the upper floors?" Sophia's eyes met mine over her wine glass, and I saw something there that looked remarkably like an invitation to discover the truth. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it is time someone found out." The wine and Sophia's gentle questioning unlocked memories I'd been carefully suppressing for years. Sitting in that dimly lit lobby, surrounded by faded grandeur and the scent of old wood and lavender, I found myself explaining how I'd become the woman who could be abandoned on a mountain road without anyone back home even noticing I was missing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I used to be different, I told Sophia, watching her weathered hands trace patterns on the worn velvet of her chair. I was the youngest senior analyst at Peterson and Associates in Boston. I specialized in international investment irregularities, finding discrepancies in overseas accounts, tracking money flows that didn't quite add up. Sophia's eyebrows rose with interest. Ah, so you are good with numbers? With finding hidden things? I corrected, the past tense bitter on my tongue. Connor always said my attention to detail was what attracted him to me initially. We met when Peterson and Associates was consulting on the financial due diligence for his first major acquisition. I was the one who spotted the accounting irregularities that saved his company from a disastrous merger. The memory was still vivid. Connor striding into our conference room in his perfectly tailored suit, demanding to know who had uncovered the hidden liabilities that his own accountants had missed. When my colleagues had pointed to me, the youngest, woman in the room, his expression had shifted from skepticism to genuine impressed interest. He'd asked me to dinner that same night. For the first 2 years, he called me his secret weapon. I continued, surprised by how much the wine was loosening my tongue. He'd bring me complex financial documents, ask for my analysis before making major decisions. He said I had a gift for seeing patterns that others missed. But somewhere around our 3rd anniversary, things had begun to change. Connor's business had grown exponentially, bringing him into contact with international clients who preferred their dealings to remain private. When I'd offered to review some contracts that seemed unusually complex, he'd laughed and said he didn't want to burden me with work stress at home. Marriage should be a sanctuary, he'd explained, taking the documents from my hands. Let's keep business and personal life separate, shall we? It had seemed reasonable at the time, even thoughtful. But gradually, the boundaries had expanded. Connor began scheduling business dinners without me, claiming his clients were old-fashioned about women in business. He'd started managing our joint finances himself, saying it was more efficient than coordinating between our 2 schedules. When Peterson and Associates had offered me a promotion that would require some travel, Connor had grown sullen and distant until I'd turned it down. He never forbade me from working, I explained to Sophia, who was listening with the focused attention of someone who understood the subtle nature of control. It was always presented as choices, my choices. He'd point out how much less stress I'd have if I didn't have to worry about client deadlines. How nice it would be to focus on creating a beautiful home, planning wonderful trips, supporting his expanding business. The erosion had been so gradual that I hadn't noticed how small my world had become until it was too late. Friends from work had stopped calling when I'd repeatedly declined invitations due to Connor's social obligations. My family had grown, distant after Connor had begun monopolizing conversations during visits, discussing his business successes while somehow making my contributions to those successes invisible. And his friends? Sophia asked, refilling our glasses with a steady hand. Alan and Clark, they are also in this business? I nodded, feeling the familiar frustration that had been building for months. They're Connor's business partners in something he calls international consulting. They formed a separate company about 2 years ago, Meridian Global Solutions. Connor claimed it was for tax purposes, to separate their overseas consulting from his domestic business. Alan Henderson was Connor's college roommate, a smooth-talking man with expensive tastes and a habit of making cutting remarks disguised as jokes. He'd never liked me, though he was careful to mask his disdain when Connor was paying attention. Clark Morrison was the technical expert of the group, quiet and intense, with an MBA from Northwestern and a talent for making complex financial structures sound perfectly legitimate. At first, I was excited about the international expansion, I admitted. I offered to help with the market analysis, to review their client contracts for potential red flags. I still remembered enough from my Peterson days to be useful. But My offers had been politely declined, then not so politely dismissed. Alan had made a joke about too many cooks in the kitchen, while Clark had suggested that international consulting was probably too complex for someone who'd never worked overseas. Connor had laughed along with them, not defending my expertise or experience. They began having meetings without me, I continued, surprised by how much resentment had built up in my chest. Even here at home, they'd send me to run errands or visit my sister when they needed to discuss sensitive client matters. Connor said it was to protect me from potential liability issues. The trips to Italy had started 6 months ago. Initially, Connor had included me, presenting them as combined business and pleasure excursions. We'd stayed at beautiful hotels in Rome and Milan while he met with what he described as European clients interested in American investment opportunities. But the meetings were always private, and I'd spent my days shopping or visiting museums alone. Then the trips became more frequent, and I was invited less often, I said, noticing how Sophia's expression had grown increasingly thoughtful. Connor claimed the meetings were becoming more technical, less social. He said I'd be bored, but I'd noticed other changes too. Connor had become secretive about his phone calls, often stepping onto our balcony or into his office when certain numbers appeared on his screen. He'd started carrying 2 phones, one for domestic business, another for what he called international contacts. The international phone was never left unattended, never charged anywhere I might accidentally see the messages. Their financial success had been remarkable, almost suspiciously so. Within 18 months of forming Meridian Global Solutions, all 3 men had purchased expensive new cars, upgraded their homes, and begun talking about early retirement. When I'd casually asked Connor about their client base, wondering what kind of consulting could be so immediately lucrative, he'd grown defensive. "Why all the questions lately?" he'd asked, his tone sharper than usual. "Don't you trust me to handle our financial future?" The implied accusation had stung. Of course I trusted him, didn't I? But my old analytical instincts kept nagging at me. In my Peterson days, I'd seen enough financial irregularities to recognize the patterns: unexplained wealth, secretive international meetings, reluctance to discuss client details or service offerings. Tonight, when they were talking outside the hotel, I told Sophia, I heard Alan mention something about quarterly transfers and keeping the documentation minimal. Clark said something about Swiss routing, but they stopped talking when they noticed I was listening. Sophia set down her wine glass with a soft clink against the wooden table. "Ava, may I ask you something? In your work before, these financial irregularities you found, what kinds of things were they?" I thought, back to my Peterson cases, remembering the satisfaction of unraveling complex schemes. Usually, it was money being moved through multiple jurisdictions to obscure its origin or destination. Shell companies in countries with bank secrecy laws. Accounts that existed only on paper, used to transfer funds without creating clear audit. Trails. And if someone wanted to hide money from American tax authorities, Sophia continued carefully, where might they put it? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implication. I felt my analytical mind engaging for the first time in months, connecting dots I'd been trained to recognize. Switzerland, obviously, but that's becoming more difficult with international reporting requirements, the Cayman Islands, certain parts of Eastern Europe. I paused, a chill running down my spine. Italy has some very private banking laws, especially for non-resident accounts. Sophia nodded slowly. And if these men have been coming to this specific hotel, to these specific mountains, many times over the past year? She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. My mind was already racing, remembering Connor's nervousness during the drive, the way all 3 men had kept glancing toward the hotel's upper floors, Alan's comment about keeping documentation minimal. "Sophia," I said quietly, "what exactly is on those locked floors?" Sophia's question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. The rational part of my mind, the part that had been systematically silenced over the past few years, was screaming that I was about to uncover something that would change everything. But the other part, the part that had learned to avoid Connor's anger and maintain peace at any cost, whispered that some doors were better left unopened. First, Sophia said, rising from her chair with surprising grace for her age, you must understand the history of this place. Then you will understand why your husband and his friends chose it. She led me behind the reception desk to a wall covered with framed photographs spanning what appeared to be several decades. The images told the story of Hotel Villa Serena's better days, elegant guests in 1960s attire lounging by a now empty pool, formal dinner parties in what must have been a grand dining room, celebrities and politicians whose faces I recognized from history books. My late husband Enrico and I bought this hotel in 1978, Sophia explained, her fingers trailing across a photograph of a handsome man with kind eyes standing beside a much younger version of herself. For 30 years, we hosted everyone from movie stars to heads of state. The location was perfect, remote enough for privacy, beautiful enough to justify the expense, close enough to Florence and Rome for convenience. But the glory days had ended with Enrico's death in 2008, followed immediately by the global financial crisis. Tourism had plummeted, especially to remote mountain locations. Sophia had been forced to close most of the hotel, keeping only the ground floor operational while the upper floors gathered dust and decay. For 5 years I barely survived, she continued, moving to a more recent photograph showing the hotel's current state of elegant decay. I was too old to maintain such a large property, too proud to sell it for a fraction of its worth. Then, 18 months ago, your husband contacted me. The timeline made my stomach clench. 18 months ago was exactly when Connor had formed Meridian Global Solutions with Allen and Clark. He said he represented American businessmen who needed a quiet place for private meetings, Sophia continued. He offered to rent the entire second floor on a monthly basis, paying triple my usual rates. The only conditions were that they required absolute privacy and access to the old hotel safe. My breath caught. The hotel safe? Sophia nodded toward a heavy wooden door behind the reception desk. Enrico had it installed in the 1980s for guests who preferred not to trust banks with their valuables. It's quite sophisticated, Swiss-made, with multiple compartments and various levels of security. Your husband was very interested in its capabilities. She opened the door to reveal a small room that had clearly once been used for storage, but had been recently cleaned and organized. Against the far wall stood an impressive vault, its thick steel door currently ajar. But what drew my attention were the newer additions to the room. A high-end computer setup, a professional-grade document scanner, and filing cabinets that looked completely out of place in the rustic setting. Connor installed all this? I asked. Though the answer was obvious. This was exactly the kind of setup someone would need to manage complex financial transactions while maintaining physical documentation in a secure location outside of any government's immediate reach. He said it was for digitizing important documents, Sophia replied, but her tone suggested she'd never quite believed the explanation. Every month, he and his friends would spend 2 or 3 days here. They brought their own food, their own equipment, never requiring any services from me except privacy and access to this room. I stepped closer to the computer setup, my analytical mind cataloging details. The scanner was commercial grade, the kind used by law firms or financial institutions to process large volumes of documents quickly. The computer appeared to be connected to a satellite internet system, expensive but necessary for reliable connectivity in this remote location. Everything suggested a sophisticated operation requiring significant investment. Did they ever tell you what kind of documents they were working with? Sophia shook her head. But I am not blind, Eva. I have seen enough in my lifetime to recognize. When men are conducting business, they prefer to keep hidden. The way they looked over their shoulders, the way they spoke in whispers, the way they paid always in cash. She moved to one of the filing cabinets and ran her fingers along its surface. This cabinet was locked when they left this afternoon, but locks in old hotels. She shrugged meaningfully. Sometimes they do not work as well as people believe. My heart began to race as I understood what she was suggesting. The cabinet contained documents, possibly the very evidence that could explain Connor's recent wealth and secretive behavior. But looking through it would cross a line I'd never crossed before, transforming me from suspicious wife to active investigator. Sophia, that would be... I struggled to find words that could encompass my moral confusion. Your husband left you abandoned on a mountain road, she said gently but firmly. He laughed as he drove away, treating you like discarded luggage. Do you owe such a man your blind loyalty? The question struck me like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the reality I'd been avoiding. Connor hadn't just abandoned me tonight. He'd been abandoning me gradually for years, dismissing my intelligence, isolating me from my career and friends, reducing me to a decorative accessory in his increasingly complicated life. You said you used to find hidden financial irregularities, Sophia continued. Perhaps it is time to use those skills again. My hands trembled as I approached the filing cabinet. The lock was indeed old and somewhat loose, requiring only gentle manipulation to open. Inside, I found precisely what my professional instincts had warned me to expect. Folders full of documents that told a story of systematic financial deception. Bank statements from institutions I recognized as notorious for their secrecy. Transfer records showing large sums moving between numbered accounts. Corporate documents establishing shell companies in jurisdictions known for minimal oversight. And most damning of all, detailed spreadsheets in Connor's familiar handwriting, tracking what appeared to be millions of dollars in undeclared income. Oh God, I whispered, sinking into the chair in front of the computer. This is exactly what I thought it might be. The documents painted a clear picture. Meridian Global Solutions wasn't just consulting for international clients. They were helping American businesses and individuals hide assets from tax authorities. The consulting fees were actually commissions for facilitating illegal tax evasion through complex offshore structures. But as I dug deeper into the files, I discovered something even more serious. Connor, Allen, and Clark weren't just helping clients evade taxes, they were skimming money from the process, creating their own undeclared accounts and falsifying documents to cover their tracks. What had started as a tax evasion service had evolved into outright fraud and money laundering. Sophia, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, do you have any idea how serious this is? These documents. They're evidence of federal crimes. Tax evasion, money laundering, fraud. Connor could go to prison for decades. But even as I said it, another realization was forming. If Connor had been conducting this operation for 18 months, earning millions in illegal income, then our entire lifestyle had been built on criminal proceeds. Our house, our cars, our expensive vacations, everything I'd enjoyed as Connor's wife had been purchased with stolen money. And tonight, when I'd started asking questions about their business, Connor had seen me as a threat to everything they'd built. That's why he'd abandoned me. Not as a cruel joke, but as a calculated move to get me away from evidence that could destroy him. What will you do? Sophia asked gently. I stared at the documents spread across the desk, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on me. I could replace everything exactly as I'd found it, pretend I'd never seen any of it, and try to rebuild my marriage based on willful ignorance. Or I could acknowledge what my professional training was telling me, that I was holding evidence of serious crimes that were probably still ongoing. I don't know, I admitted. If I report this, Connor's life is over. Our marriage is over. Everything I've built for the past 8 years was built on lies, Sophia finished quietly. Ava, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is acknowledge The truth, even when it destroys the life we thought we wanted. Outside, the mountain night had grown cold and still. Inside this small room filled with evidence of betrayal, I faced the most important decision of my life. The woman Connor had abandoned on this mountain road a few hours ago would have carefully replaced these documents and pretended she'd never seen them. But sitting here, surrounded by proof of his crimes and contempt, I felt something stirring inside me that had been dormant for years. The analytical mind that had once made me one of Boston's most promising investigators was awakening, and it was furious. The weight of what I'd discovered kept me awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling of the small guest room Sophia had prepared for me. By dawn, I'd convinced myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation. Connor might be controlling and dismissive, but he wasn't a criminal. There had to be some context I was missing, some legitimate business purpose behind those documents that my rusty analytical skills had misinterpreted. I needed to talk to him, to give him a chance to explain before I jumped to conclusions that could destroy our marriage. Whatever problems we had, abandoning me on a mountain road was cruel, but it didn't automatically make him a money launderer. I owed us, the benefit of the doubt. Sophia had given me the hotel's landline number, and I spent the early morning hours trying to reach Connor's cell phone. Each call went straight to voicemail, his familiar recording cheerfully instructing callers to leave a detailed message. I left 3 increasingly desperate voicemails before accepting that he was either ignoring me or had his phone turned off. Connor, it's Eva. I'm still at the hotel in the mountains. I know you're angry, but we need to talk. Please call me back. The first message had been conciliatory, designed to de-escalate whatever fight we were having. Connor, this is ridiculous. It's been 12 hours. I don't care how angry you are. You can't just leave me stranded. Call me back immediately. The second had carried more edge, my frustration bleeding through. Connor, I found the documents in the safe room. I know about Meridian Global Solutions, about the offshore accounts. Call me back right now, or I'm calling the authorities. The third message had been pure threat, born from exhaustion and growing certainty that my worst suspicions were correct. But still, no response. Next, I tried Alan's number, hoping Connor's business partner might be more reasonable. Alan picked, up on the second ring, his voice carrying that familiar note of amused condescension that had always made my skin crawl. Well, if it isn't the princess herself, how's the mountain air treating you, Eva? Alan, this isn't funny anymore, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need Connor to come pick me up, or I need you to tell me which hotel you're staying at so I can meet you there. His laugh was sharp and unpleasant. Oh, I don't think that's going to happen. Connor's made it very clear that you need some time to think about your behavior last night. Maybe a few days roughing it will help you remember your place. The casual cruelty in his voice made my stomach turn. My place? Alan, I'm his wife, not his employee. Are you, though? He asked, and I could hear the malicious smile in his voice. Because from where I'm sitting, you seem more like a liability Connor's been carrying around out of misplaced loyalty. Do you have any idea how much easier our business runs when you're not around asking inconvenient questions? The admission hit me like a slap. They'd been planning this, not just last night's abandonment, but my gradual exclusion from Connor's life. I wasn't paranoid. I was unwanted baggage they'd finally decided to discard. Alan, I know about the Swiss accounts. I know about the shell companies and the money laundering operation you're running out of this hotel. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all trace of amusement. You don't know anything, Eva. And if you're smart, which Connor used to claim you were, you'll keep your mouth shut and find your own way home. Because if you start making accusations you can't prove, you'll discover just how unpleasant Connor can be when his livelihood is threatened. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone with my heart racing. Alan's threat had been unmistakable, but it had also confirmed my worst fears. They weren't just hiding their business from me. They were hiding it from law enforcement. Tried Clark next, hoping the quieter partner might be more reasonable, but his phone went directly to an automated message saying the number was no longer in service. Either he'd changed his number recently, or he was using burner phones for their Italian operations. Desperate, I called our hotel in Florence, thinking perhaps they'd returned there and I could arrange to meet them. But the concierge informed me that their reservation had been canceled that morning, with no forwarding information provided. Did they leave any message for Eva Davis? I asked, clinging to hope. I'm sorry, Signora, but there is no record of any messages. They'd erased me completely, cutting off every potential avenue of contact. The thoroughness of their abandonment was starting to feel less like cruel impulse and more like calculated strategy. My next call was to our house in Boston, thinking perhaps Connor had flown home early and was sulking in familiar surroundings. But the phone rang endlessly. Connor had disabled our answering machine months ago, claiming he preferred the simplicity of relying on cell phones. Growing more desperate, I tried Connor's assistant Haley, a competent young woman who managed his domestic business calendar. She picked up on the first ring, her voice bright and professional. Mr. Davis's office. This is Haley speaking. Haley, it's Eva. I'm trying to reach Connor urgently. Do you know where he is? There was a pause. That lasted just a beat too long. Mrs. Davis, I thought you were traveling together in Italy. We were, but we got separated. I need to know how to reach him. Another pause. Longer this time. Mrs. Davis, I'm really not supposed to discuss Mr. Davis's travel plans with anyone. Company policy, you understand. The formal response from someone who'd been casually chatting with me about weekend plans just weeks ago sent a chill down my spine. Haley, I'm his wife. Surely company policy doesn't apply to family emergencies. I'm sorry, but Mr. Davis was very specific about maintaining confidentiality regarding his current trip. He said that absolutely no one should be given information about his whereabouts or contact details. No one? He specifically said no one could know where he is? That's correct. He was quite emphatic about it. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Connor hadn't just abandoned me impulsively, he'd prepared for it, instructing his staff to cut off my access to him completely. This had been planned, probably for weeks. Haley, I said carefully, when exactly did Connor give you these instructions? The pause this time was so long I thought she might have hung up. Mrs. Davis, I really think you should speak to Mr. Davis directly about— When, Haley? 3 weeks ago, she whispered. He said it was for security reasons related to some sensitive business negotiations. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks before our trip to Italy, Connor had been planning to cut me off from all contact. My abandonment last night hadn't been a spontaneous act of cruelty. It had been the execution of a carefully orchestrated plan. But why? If Connor wanted a divorce, why not just ask for one? Why the elaborate scheme to strand me in a foreign country? Unless my questions about their business had made me more than just an inconvenient wife. Unless I'd become a threat that needed to be neutralized. I thought about the documents in Sophia's safe room, about the millions of dollars in illegal transactions I'd uncovered. If Connor suspected I might expose their operation, abandoning me in rural Italy would serve two purposes. It would get me away from evidence, and it would make me look unstable if I tried to report them to authorities. Who would believe the abandoned wife of a respected businessman? Especially if she was making wild accusations from a foreign country while obviously distraught about her failing marriage. Mrs. Davis? Haley's voice brought me back to the present. Are you still there? Yes, I managed. Haley, I need you to do something for me. I need you to look up the contact information for Peterson and Associates, the financial consulting firm. Ask for Marcus Weber. He's a senior partner there. I don't think I should. Haley, please. Just this once. I think Connor might be in serious trouble and Marcus might be able to help. After a long pause, she agreed to send me Marcus's direct number via text message. It was a small victory, but it felt like the first step toward reclaiming some agency in my increasingly desperate situation. As I waited for the text to arrive, I stared out at the mountains surrounding Hotel Villa Serena and faced an uncomfortable truth. Connor, Allen, and Clark had successfully isolated me. They'd cut off my access to money, transportation, and communication. They'd made it clear that my concerns about their business were unwelcome and potentially dangerous to voice. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd abandoned me in the one place that contained evidence of their crimes, and they'd left me with someone who had her own reasons to want the truth exposed. The text from Haley arrived with Marcus Weber's number, and I realized that my failed attempts to return to my old life had actually shown me something valuable. That old life was built on lies and was never coming back. It was time to stop trying to go backward and start moving forward. Marcus Weber's voice across the international connection was exactly as I remembered, calm, analytical, and completely unflappable. Even when I explained that I was calling from a remote Italian hotel where my husband had abandoned me, he simply asked practical questions about my immediate safety before moving on to business. "Ava, I have to say, it's good to hear from you," he said after I'd given him the basic outline of my situation. "I've wondered more than once what happened to one of our most promising investigators. Connor always said you'd decided consulting wasn't for you anymore." "Connor said a lot of things," I replied, feeling a familiar surge of anger at how thoroughly my husband had controlled the narrative of my career exit. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If someone brought you evidence of a sophisticated money laundering operation involving American citizens hiding assets offshore, what would be the proper procedure?" The pause on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. Marcus hadn't become a senior partner at one of Boston's most prestigious financial consulting firms by missing implications. "Eva, are we talking hypothetically here, or do you have actual evidence?" I looked toward the safe room where Sophia was carefully photographing documents with an old digital camera she'd found in the hotel's storage closet. We'd decided that having backup copies was essential before I made any irreversible decisions. I have bank statements, transfer records, corporate documents for shell companies, and handwritten ledgers tracking what appears to be millions in undeclared income, I said. "It's a complete paper trail spanning at least 18 months. Marcus whistled low. "That's not just evidence, Eva. That's a prosecutor's dream. With documentation like that, the FBI could probably wrap up a case in 6 months instead of 6 years. "The FBI?" My voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "Eva, what you're describing isn't just tax evasion. Money laundering is a federal crime that carries serious prison time. If the amounts are as large as you're suggesting, we're talking about decades behind bars." I closed my eyes, trying to absorb the reality of what reporting Connor would mean. It wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the complete destruction of the life we'd built together. Our house would be seized as proceeds of criminal activity. His business would be shut down. His reputation, everything he'd worked for, would be gone. "Marcus, what if I just walked away? Pretended I never saw any of this?" "You could," he said carefully. "But Eva, think about what you're really asking. You're talking about covering up ongoing criminal activity. And if these men are as sophisticated as you're describing, do you really think they're going to let you just walk away with this knowledge?" His words echoed Allen's threat from earlier, making my stomach clench with anxiety. "What do you mean?" "I mean that people who run multi-million-dollar criminal enterprises don't usually leave loose ends lying around. Your husband abandoned you at the exact location where he conducts his illegal business. That's either the most incredible coincidence in history, or it was calculated to put you exactly where you are now." A chill ran down my spine as I processed the implication. "You think Connor wanted me to find this evidence?" I think Connor wanted you isolated and discredited, Marcus said grimly. Think about it from his perspective. His wife is asking uncomfortable questions about his business. She has the exact professional background needed to understand what she's seeing. So he creates a situation where she appears emotionally unstable, abandoned in a foreign country, making wild accusations about criminal activity while obviously distraught about her marriage. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. He was setting me up to look crazy, or desperate for attention, or vindictive. Take your pick. The point is, if you'd tried to report this from Boston after a messy separation, who would have believed you? But if you report it now, with physical evidence and corroborating witnesses, I have credibility, I finished. Exactly. The question is, what do you want to do with that credibility? I walked to the window overlooking the hotel's neglected gardens, watching Sophia tend to a small patch of herbs she'd managed to keep alive, despite the property's general decay. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to waste effort on lost causes, focusing her energy only on what could realistically be saved. Marcus, if I report this, what happens to me? I mean, legally? You'd be protected as a whistleblower, assuming you cooperate fully with the investigation. The government has strong incentives to protect people who help them build cases like this, but Eva? He paused, choosing his words carefully. You need to understand that cooperating with federal investigators isn't something you can take back. Once you make that call, there's no going back to your old life. What old life? I asked, surprised by the bitterness in my own voice. My husband has made it clear that I'm a liability he no longer wants to carry. His business partners have threatened me. His staff has been instructed to cut off my access to him. What exactly would I be going back to? That's a fair point, Marcus conceded. But Ava, I need you to think carefully about what you're choosing instead. Reporting this will make you a target for retaliation until arrests are made. It will require months of testimony and legal proceedings. It will mean accepting that everything you've built with Connor was based on lies. As he spoke, I found myself thinking about the past few years of my marriage, the gradual erosion of my independence, the systematic dismissal of my professional expertise, the growing isolation from friends and career opportunities. Had I been building something real with Connor? Or had I been systematically diminished to prevent me from becoming the exact threat I was now considering becoming? Marcus, I said slowly, do you remember the Castellano case? The shipping company that was laundering money through their Mediterranean operations? Of course, that was one of your best investigations. I remember being so angry when we discovered how they'd been exploiting their position to facilitate criminal activity. I remember feeling like we had a moral obligation to expose them, regardless of the consequences. You were relentless on that case, Marcus agreed. You said that people who used legitimate businesses as fronts for criminal activity were stealing credibility from everyone who operated honestly. The memory crystallized my decision. I'd once believed that financial crimes weren't victimless, that every dollar hidden from taxation was a dollar stolen from schools, hospitals, and infrastructure that honest citizens funded through their compliance with the law. Those beliefs hadn't changed just because the criminal was my husband. Marcus, I need you to connect me with the right people at the FBI, I said, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. I want to report this properly, with full documentation and cooperation. Are you sure, Eva? Because once I make that call, I'm sure. And surprisingly, I was. For the first time in years, I was making a decision based on my own moral compass, rather than Connor's convenience. All right, I'll contact Agent Sydney Chen. She specializes in international financial crimes. But Eva, I need you to promise me something. Don't confront your husband or his partners. Don't give them any indication that you're cooperating with authorities. The most dangerous moment in any investigation is when the targets realize they're being investigated. After ending the call, I sat quietly in Sophia's small office, absorbing the magnitude of what I'd just set in motion. In the space of 24 hours, I'd gone from dutiful wife to federal informant. Connor had abandoned me thinking he was neutralizing a threat, but he'd actually created a far more dangerous enemy, one with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from his downfall. Sophia appeared in the doorway with a cup of espresso and a gentle smile. "You have made your decision?" "I have," I said, accepting the cup gratefully. "But, Sophia, I need you to understand what this means. When the authorities get involved, this hotel will become evidence in a federal investigation. There will be agents, documents seized, probably media attention." "Good," she said firmly. "This place has been used for dishonest purposes long enough. It is time for the truth." As I sipped the espresso, I realized that my choice hadn't just been about reporting Connor's crimes. It had been about choosing the person I wanted to be. The analytical, ethical investigator I'd once been, rather than the diminished accessory I'd allowed myself to become. Connor had thought he was discarding me like unwanted baggage. Instead, he'd freed me to become his worst nightmare. Agent Sydney Chen called me back within 3 hours of Marcus's contact, her voice crisp and professional, despite the international connection. She listened without interruption as I outlined what I'd discovered, occasionally asking for clarification about specific documents or timeline details. When I finished, the silence stretched long enough that I began to worry the call had dropped. "Mrs. Davis," she finally said, "what you're describing aligns with several ongoing investigations into American tax evasion schemes operating in Europe. We've been tracking suspicious money flows through Italian banks for the past year, but we've lacked the documentation to build solid cases. So this information is useful?" "Useful?" She almost laughed. "Mrs. Davis, this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. But I need to be completely transparent with you about what cooperation will require." Over the next hour, Agent Chen walked me through the realities of becoming a federal informant. I would need to document everything I'd found, providing detailed photographs and chain of custody records for all evidence. I would likely need to wear recording devices during any future contact with Connor, Allen, or Clark. Most importantly, I would need to maintain my current situation for several more days, while FBI agents arranged to travel to Italy and coordinate with local authorities. The Italian Guardia di Finanza, their financial police, have been very cooperative with our international investigations, Agent Chen explained. But these things take time to coordinate properly. Can you remain at your current location safely for the next week? I looked around Sophia's small office, with its faded photographs and worn furniture, trying to imagine spending a week in this remote mountain hotel while federal agents built a case around my marriage's destruction. I think so. But Agent Chen, what happens if Connor tries to contact me? What if he comes back here? If he contacts you, you act completely normal. Don't give him any indication that you've discovered anything unusual. If he returns to the hotel, you document everything he does, but you don't confront him. Mrs. Davis, I cannot stress this enough. Your safety depends on these men believing you're exactly what they think you are, an abandoned wife with no knowledge of their business operations. After the call ended, I sat in the gathering dusk feeling the weight of what I'd committed to. 7 days of living a lie, pretending to be helpless while secretly building a federal case against my own husband. 7 days of uncertainty while agents I'd never met prepared to tear apart the only life I'd known for the past 8 years. Sophia found me on the small terrace behind the hotel, staring out at the mountains that had seemed so beautiful yesterday and now felt like prison walls. She carried a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, settling beside me with the easy companionship I was already beginning to depend on. "You are frightened," she observed, pouring generous portions of what smelled like excellent Chianti. "Terrified," I admitted. "This morning I was a housewife trying to save her marriage. Tonight I'm a federal informant planning to send my husband to prison. I have no idea who I am anymore." Sophia sipped her wine thoughtfully before responding. When Enrico died, I spent months pretending he was simply away on business. I would set 2 places at dinner, leave his clothes in the wardrobe, maintain conversations with his photograph. I thought I was honoring his memory, but really I was afraid to discover who I might be without him. What changed? The hotel began falling apart. The roof leaked. The furnace failed. Creditors called constantly. I realized I could continue, pretending Enrico would return to handle these problems, or I could learn to handle them myself. She gestured toward the building behind us. It was not easy. I made many mistakes, but I discovered that the woman I became was stronger than the woman I had been. What if I'm making the biggest mistake of my life? What if Connor has reasonable explanations for everything I found? Sophia's expression grew gentle but firm. Ava, reasonable men do not abandon their wives on mountain roads for asking questions. Honest men do not conduct business in secret rooms with hidden safes. You know this. Your professional training told you exactly what those documents meant. She was right, of course. My analytical mind had recognized the patterns immediately, even though my emotional mind wanted to find alternative explanations. The evidence was overwhelming. Systematic tax evasion, money laundering, fraud. Connor wasn't just bending rules. He was breaking serious laws. But what comes after? I asked. Let's say the FBI arrests Connor and his partners. Let's say I testify, and they go to prison. What's my life then? I don't have a career anymore? I don't have friends? I don't even have a place to live that isn't connected to Connor's criminal money? You have something more valuable, Sophia said quietly. You have the chance to choose who you become next. That night, I lay awake in the small guest room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain countryside. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed midnight, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Sleep eluded me as my mind raced through possibilities and consequences. By 3 in the morning, I'd abandoned the pretense of sleeping and returned to the safe room to study the documents more carefully. Using the analytical skills I'd thought were permanently rusty, I began constructing a comprehensive picture of Connor's operation. The sophistication was impressive, even admirable in a twisted way. They'd created a network of shell companies across 4 countries, each designed to obscure the flow of money through increasingly complex transactions. American clients would pay consulting fees to Meridian Global Solutions, which would then be transferred through Swiss accounts, converted to cryptocurrency, moved through Estonian digital banks, and finally deposited in numbered Italian accounts accessible only through the hotel's secure computer system. The Italian accounts were the genius of the scheme. Italy's banking privacy laws, combined with the remote location and Sophia's unwitting cooperation, created a nearly perfect system for storing and accessing hidden wealth. Clients could retrieve their money during vacation trips to Tuscany, making withdrawals look like ordinary tourist expenses. But Connor, Allen, and Clark had gotten greedy. Instead of simply facilitating their clients' tax evasion, they'd begun skimming percentages for themselves, creating false documentation to hide their theft. What had started as illegal but relatively organized had devolved into outright fraud. As dawn broke over the mountains, I found myself feeling something unexpected: professional satisfaction. For the first time in years, I was using my analytical skills to solve a complex puzzle, and I was good at it. Better than good. I was uncovering details that would probably make the FBI's case significantly stronger. Sophia appeared with coffee and fresh bread, just as I was finishing my analysis. You have been working all night? I wanted to understand exactly what Connor was doing, I explained, showing her the organizational chart I'd drawn connecting all the shell companies and money flows. It's actually quite brilliant, from a purely technical perspective. But also quite illegal? Extremely illegal. And Sophia... I hesitated, unsure how to explain what else I'd discovered. I found records showing that Connor has been paying you far more than necessary for use of this hotel. I think you might be considered an unwitting accomplice, unless we can prove you had no knowledge of what he was really doing here." Her face went pale as she absorbed the implication. "You mean I could also be arrested?" "Possibly. But if you cooperate with the investigation, if you help document everything they've been doing here," Agent Chen said, "the authorities are usually reasonable about distinguishing between victims and criminals." The next week stretched ahead of us like a bridge we had to cross together. Two women who'd been deceived by men they'd trusted, now forced to choose between comfortable lies and dangerous truths. But as I watched the sunrise paint the mountains, gold and pink, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. I was finally moving forward instead of being carried along by someone else's decisions. 3 days into my week of waiting, everything went wrong at once. It started with a phone call at 6 in the morning, Connor's number flashing on the hotel's landline. Sophia answered with her usual polite greeting, then immediately handed me the phone with wide, concerned eyes. "Eva, darling, thank God." Connor's voice was honey smooth, carrying that particular tone he used when he was about to manipulate me into compliance. "I've been sick with worry about you. Alan told me you called making some wild accusations, and I realized we need to talk immediately." My heart hammered against my ribs as I forced my voice to remain steady. "Connor, where are you? I've been stranded here for 3 days." "I know, sweetheart, and I'm so sorry." The business meetings ran much longer than expected, and by the time I could get away, it was too late to drive those mountain roads safely. "But I'm coming to get you right now. I'll be there within the hour." Panic flooded through me. Agent Chen had been very clear. I was to document any contact but avoid face-to-face meetings until FBI agents arrived. The Italian authorities weren't scheduled to coordinate the operation for another 4 days. "Connor, you don't need to drive. All the way up here. I can meet you in Florence." "Nonsense. I'm already on my way. Besides, I want to see this charming little hotel you've been staying at." It sounds quaint. The way he said quaint sent ice through my veins. Connor despised anything that wasn't polished and expensive. If he was suddenly interested in seeing Hotel Villa Serena, it wasn't out of curiosity about my accommodations. "Eva?" His voice sharpened when I didn't respond immediately. "You're still there, aren't you? You haven't wandered off or done anything impulsive?" "Of course I'm still here. Where else would I go? Good girl. See you soon." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone with my hands shaking. Sophia was watching me with growing alarm, clearly understanding from my expression that something was terribly wrong. "He is coming here?" she asked. "In an hour. Sophia, we need to hide everything. The documents, the photographs, any evidence that we've been investigating." A crash of breaking glass from the front of the hotel cut off my words. We rushed toward the lobby to find the front door standing open, mountain wind whipping through the entrance. But it wasn't the wind that had broken the decorative vase near the reception desk. Alan Henderson stood in the doorway, his expensive suit rumpled and his usually perfect hair disheveled. Behind him, Clark Morrison carried what appeared to be a heavy briefcase and wore the expression of a man who'd missed several nights of sleep. "Well, well," Alan drawled, his eyes scanning the lobby before settling on me with undisguised hostility. "If it isn't our little problem child. Connor's on his way up to collect you, but we thought we'd arrive early to have a chat." "You broke into my hotel," Sophia said sharply, her English suddenly much more fluent than she'd previously revealed. "You will leave immediately, or I will call the police." Alan laughed, but it was an ugly sound. "The police? Lady, do you have any idea what your little hotel has been used for? Trust me, calling the authorities is the last thing you want to do right now." Clark moved past Alan toward the reception desk, his briefcase in hand. "We need to collect some materials from upstairs," he said quietly. "Business documents that belong to us." "I don't think so," I said, stepping between Clark and the staircase. My voice sounded braver than I felt, but some instinct told me that letting them access the safe room would be disastrous. This is private property, and you don't have permission to... The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. Alan's hand caught me across the cheek with enough force to send me stumbling backward, stars exploding across my vision. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard Sophia cry out in alarm. "Eva, sweetheart," Alan said, his voice mockingly gentle as he grabbed my arm to steady me. "I think you've misunderstood the situation here. We're not asking permission. We're collecting our property, and you're going to help us." The physical violence was shocking, but what terrified me more was the cold calculation in his eyes. These weren't men who'd come to retrieve documents. They were men who'd come to eliminate evidence and witnesses. "The safe room," Clark said quietly to Alan. "Everything needs to be cleared out before Connor arrives. He can't know how much we've had to expose." My blood turned to ice as I understood their plan. They weren't just here to collect documents, they were here to clean up loose ends. Connor's phone call hadn't been about reconciliation, it had been about timing. While he kept me distracted with promises of rescue, Alan and Clark were destroying evidence. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed I was still the helpless, compliant wife who would stand aside while they conducted their business. They had no idea that I'd spent the past 3 days photographing every document, copying every file, and building a comprehensive case that existed far beyond anything they could destroy in this hotel. "Sophia," I said carefully, my cheek still throbbing from Alan's slap. "Perhaps you should show these gentlemen to the safe room. I'm sure they know exactly what they're looking for." Sophia's eyes met mine, and I saw understanding flash between us. She'd grasped the same truth I had. Letting them think they were successfully destroying evidence while secretly preserving copies was our only chance of survival. "Of course," Sophia said with apparent resignation. "Follow me, signori. Though I should warn you, some of the equipment upstairs has been problematic lately." As the three of them headed toward the safe room, I moved quickly to the small office, behind the reception desk where Sophia kept her personal computer. Hidden in a folder labeled Hotel Receipts 2019 were digital copies of every document we'd photographed, plus detailed notes about Connor's operation that I'd compiled over the past 3 days. My hands shook as I attached the files to an email addressed to Agent Chen, adding a brief message. "Evidence being destroyed. Send help immediately. Hotel Villa Serena. Coordinates attached." The email sent just as I heard Alan's voice echoing angrily from upstairs. "What the hell happened to the filing cabinet? It's completely empty." Connor would arrive within minutes, expecting to find his abandoned wife waiting helplessly for rescue. Instead, he would find federal evidence already in FBI hands and his entire operation exposed. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs told me my moment of safety was over. Alan and Clark were returning, and they were not going to be pleased with what they'd found. Or rather, what they hadn't found. But as I deleted the sent email from Sophia's computer and prepared to face whatever came next, I realized something. That surprised me. I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in my marriage, I held all the cards. Connor had taught me to be helpless, but he'd forgotten that helplessness can be the perfect disguise for someone planning revenge. The confrontation I'd been dreading never came. When Alan and Clark thundered down the stairs, their faces dark with rage, Connor's Mercedes was already pulling into the gravel parking lot. The sound of his car door slamming echoed across the courtyard, and suddenly, both men's expressions shifted from anger to carefully controlled calm. "Eva!" Connor's voice carried across the lobby as he strode through the entrance, his arms outstretched in a performance of concerned husband. "Darling, I'm so sorry about all this. Are you all right?" I played my part perfectly, allowing him to embrace me while fighting every instinct to pull away. Over his shoulder, I watched Alan and Clark exchange meaningful glances, clearly communicating that whatever they'd discovered upstairs would have to wait. I'm fine, I said, my voice carrying just the right note of wounded confusion. Connor, I don't understand what happened. Why did you leave me here? A terrible misunderstanding, he said smoothly, his hand stroking my hair in what would have looked like affectionate comfort to any observer. I thought you were following in the other car. When I realized what had happened, I've been sick with worry. It was a masterful performance, and 3 days ago I might have believed it. But now I could see the calculation behind his concerned expression, the way his eyes scanned the lobby for any signs of disturbance. Gentlemen, he said to Alan and Clark, his tone carefully neutral. I assume everything went smoothly with your business here? Perfectly, Alan replied, though his jaw was tight with suppressed tension. All taken care of. We should probably head back to Florence soon. Our flight tomorrow morning is quite early. Of course. Connor's arm around my waist tightened slightly. Eva and I will follow shortly. I just want to thank Signora. He looked questioningly. At Sofia Benedetti, she supplied quietly. Sofia Benedetti. Signora Benedetti for her hospitality during this unfortunate situation. Connor reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Please accept this as compensation for any inconvenience. Sophia accepted the envelope with trembling hands, and I could see from Connor's satisfied expression that he believed her fear was about being caught harboring his abandoned wife. He had no idea that her trembling was from anger rather than intimidation. After Alan and Clark left, Connor insisted on seeing my room, making conversation about the hotel's rustic charm while his eyes catalogued every detail. I watched him, process the modest accommodations, the simple furnishings, the obvious signs that I'd been living like a budget traveler rather than the pampered wife he'd left behind. You poor thing, he said, running his fingers along the worn wooden dresser. This must have been quite an adjustment for you. No room service, no spa facilities. His voice carried that familiar edge of condescension masked as sympathy. Sophia has been very kind, I replied carefully. She made sure I had everything I needed. I'm sure she did. Connor's smile didn't reach his eyes as he moved toward the window overlooking the mountains. It's beautiful here, in a primitive way. Very isolated. I can see why you might have felt vulnerable. The implied threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. He was reminding me how alone I'd been, how dependent on the kindness of strangers, how easily that kindness could be withdrawn. That evening, Connor took me to dinner at a small restaurant in the nearby village, playing the role of devoted husband making amends. He ordered expensive wine, asked solicitous questions about my experience at the hotel, and listened with apparent concern as I described my 3 days of uncertainty and worry. I feel terrible about the misunderstanding, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. I should have realized you might interpret our little joke as abandonment. You know how Alan can be with his pranks. Sometimes he doesn't think about how they might affect someone as sensitive as you. Even as he spoke, I marveled at his ability to rewrite history. What I'd experienced as calculated cruelty was now a little joke and a misunderstanding. My distress wasn't a reasonable response to being abandoned in a foreign country, but evidence of my excessive sensitivity. I was scared, Connor, I said, allowing vulnerability to color my voice. I didn't know if you were coming back. Oh, sweetheart. His thumb stroked across my knuckles in a gesture that would have looked tender to anyone watching. Of course. I was coming back. Did you really think I would leave my wife stranded in the mountains? The question hung between us, loaded with implication. He was testing me, trying to determine how much damage his abandonment had done to my trust, to my compliance, whether I still believed in the version of our marriage he'd been selling me for years. I suppose I just panicked, I said finally. Being alone in a strange place, not speaking the language, it made me realize how much I depend on you. His smile this time was genuine, the satisfied expression of a man whose investment in my dependence was paying dividends. That's what marriage is about, Eva. Partnership, mutual support. I take care of the complicated things. Business, finances, major decisions, and you take care of making our life beautiful and comfortable. It was the most honest thing he'd said all evening, a clear articulation of how he viewed our relationship. I was decoration, not partner, an accessory to be maintained, not an equal to be consulted. You're right, I agreed softly. I don't know what I was thinking, asking all those questions about your business. It's not my area of expertise. No, it's not, he said, and this time there was no attempt to soften the condescension. Which is why I handle it. Trust me, darling, the financial world is far more complicated than anything you dealt with in your little consulting job years ago. My little consulting job. The career I'd given up to support his ambitions, the expertise he'd once claimed to value, reduced to a diminutive that made it sound like a hobby I'd outgrown. But beneath my apparent acceptance, my mind was cataloging every word, every gesture, every revelation of his true character. Tomorrow we would return to Boston, where I would resume playing the role of grateful wife while secretly cooperating with federal investigators. Connor believed he'd successfully handled a crisis, neutralizing my curiosity and reestablishing control. He had no idea that his week of abandonment had transformed me from dependent wife into federal asset. As we drove back to the hotel through the dark mountain roads, Connor's hand resting possessively on my knee, I realized that my real education was just beginning. For years I'd been learning to be smaller, quieter, more compliant. Now I was learning to be something far more dangerous, completely invisible while being completely aware. Connor thought he'd won this round, but he'd actually just provided me with a front row seat to watch his empire collapse. The flight back to Boston felt like traveling between two different worlds. Connor dozed in first class beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand in what appeared to be affectionate reassurance. To any observer, we looked like a reconciled couple returning from a romantic getaway. Only I knew that I was actually returning as an undercover federal informant, carrying secrets that would destroy everything Connor had built. Agent Chen had sent detailed instructions via encrypted email during our layover in Rome. I was to maintain normal routines while documenting any suspicious activities. Most importantly, I was to begin gradually regaining access to Connor's business operations, not through direct questioning, which had already aroused his suspicion, but through the subtle manipulation techniques she outlined in what she called investigative integration. The key is to make yourself useful again, Agent Chen had written. Your husband dismissed you as a threat because he believes you're professionally incompetent. Use that assumption against him. Back in our Beacon Hill brownstone, I began implementing her strategy with the patience of someone who had finally found her true calling. The house felt different now, not like a home I shared with my husband, but like a crime scene I was authorized to investigate. Connor resumed his normal patterns immediately, treating our Italian crisis as though it had never happened. He returned to his office downtown, attended his usual business dinners, and scheduled meetings with Allen and Clark, as if abandoning me on a mountain road had been a minor scheduling conflict rather than a calculated act of cruelty. But I was no longer the same woman he'd left behind. Every conversation became an opportunity to gather intelligence. Every casual comment about his work was filed away for my evening reports to Agent Chen. Every phone call I overheard was transcribed and analyzed for patterns. My first breakthrough came within a week of our return. Connor had always been careless about his home office, leaving documents scattered across his desk when he thought I had no interest in understanding them. Now, I photographed everything during his morning runs, building a comprehensive picture of Meridian Global Solutions' domestic operations. The scope was larger than I'd realized. Through careful analysis of meeting notes and client correspondence, I discovered that Connor's Italian operation was just one node in an international network. They had similar arrangements in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and what appeared to be a newer operation in Malta. "Eva, darling, you seem distracted lately," Connor commented one evening as I prepared dinner. He was reading financial reports at our kitchen table, wine glass in hand, completely unaware that I'd photographed those same reports that morning. "Just adjusting to being home," I replied, keeping my voice light. "The Italy trip was so stressful. I'm still processing everything that happened. You're not still upset about that misunderstanding, are you?" He looked up from his papers with practiced concern. "Because I thought we'd moved past that." "Of course not." "But Connor?" I paused, as if gathering courage. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how I should trust you to handle the complicated things. You're absolutely right. I realize I don't know nearly enough about what you do." His expression sharpened slightly. "What do you mean?" "Well, when Alan and Clark were discussing those Swiss accounts, I felt completely lost. I used to think I understood international finance, but clearly I'm more out of touch than I realized. I was walking a careful line, showing just enough knowledge to be useful while maintaining the appearance of professional inadequacy that kept me beneath suspicion." "The Swiss accounts are quite technical," Connor said slowly. "Not really something you need to worry about." "I know, but it made me feel so excluded. Like I'm not smart enough to understand my own husband's success." I let vulnerability creep into my voice. "Maybe I could take some courses? Update my skills so I could at least follow the conversations when your colleagues are here?" Connor set down his wine glass, studying my face with the intensity he usually reserved for complex financial documents. I could see him weighing the risks of allowing me closer to his operations against the benefits of having a wife who could appear more sophisticated at business social events. "What kind of courses?" he asked carefully. "Maybe something in international banking? Or updated compliance regulations? I saw an extension program at Harvard Business School that looks interesting." The mention of Harvard, Connor's alma mater, seemed to tip the scales. His expression softened into the patronizing smile I'd learned to recognize as his approval of my attempts at self-improvement. "That's actually not a bad idea," he said. "You always were bright, Eva. You just need some updating to understand how much more complex things have become since your Peterson days." Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the role of eager student with an enthusiasm that wasn't entirely feigned. The Harvard Extension courses were legitimately fascinating, covering international banking regulations and compliance requirements that directly applied to understanding Connor's criminal operations. But my real education was happening in the evenings when I compiled my daily intelligence reports for Agent Chen. She'd assigned me a secure communication system that allowed me to upload documents and observations without leaving digital traces on our home computers. "Your intelligence is proving invaluable," she wrote in one encrypted response. "We're beginning to see connections between your husband's operation and several other cases we've been investigating. The Italian authorities are particularly interested in your documentation of the Hotel Villa Serena setup." As my confidence grew, I began pushing boundaries more deliberately. I started attending some of Connor's business dinners, playing the role of the intellectually curious wife who was finally trying to understand her husband's sophisticated work. Alan and Clark seemed amused by my questions, treating them as evidence of my charming naivety rather than systematic intelligence gathering. "Eva's been taking courses," Connor would explain when I asked particularly pointed questions about international banking regulations. "She's trying to catch up to the modern financial world." Their condescension was my camouflage. Every dismissive laugh, every patronizing explanation, every assumption that I was too intellectually limited to understand what I was really seeing, gave me more freedom to observe and document. By the end of my second month as an undercover informant, I had compiled what Agent Chen described as prosecutorial gold, Detailed documentation of ongoing criminal activity, recorded conversations revealing intent to defraud, and financial records showing millions in hidden assets. But more importantly, I had discovered something about myself that Connor's years of diminishment had almost destroyed. I was exceptionally good at this work. The analytical skills that had made me successful at Peterson & Associates were not only intact, but sharpened by years of learning to read subtle social cues and emotional manipulation. You have a natural talent for this kind of investigation. Agent Chen told me during one of our rare in-person meetings at a coffee shop far from my usual neighborhood. Have you ever considered that this might be more than just a civic duty? The Bureau is always looking for people with your combination of financial expertise and investigative instincts. The suggestion planted a seed that grew stronger each day. For years, I'd defined myself in relation to Connor, as his wife, his supporter, his abandoned victim. But working undercover had shown me a different possibility. I could be someone whose intelligence and skills were not just valued but essential. Connor thought he'd broken me down to rebuild me as his ideal accessory. Instead, he'd accidentally created the perfect weapon for his own destruction. 3 months into my double life as federal informant, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. Sophia's heavily accented English crackled. Through the international connection, her voice tight with excitement and worry. Ava, cara mia, something very strange has happened here at the hotel. Men in expensive suits came yesterday asking many questions about the property. They offered to buy Villa Serena for 3 times what it is worth. My blood ran cold. What kind of men, Sophia? Did they say who they represented? They claimed to be from some development company in Rome, but... She paused, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. They knew too much about the hotel's history. They asked specifically about the safe room, about the computer equipment. That was removed. Eva, I think they are connected to your husband's business. The implications hit me immediately. Connor, Allen, and Clark were trying to buy the hotel to control the crime scene. If they owned the property, they could destroy any remaining evidence and ensure Sophia's silence permanently. Sophia, please don't sign anything, I said urgently. Promise me you won't make any decisions without calling me first. Of course not. But Eva. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I am an old woman alone on this mountain. If these men decide, they want this property, I do not know how long I can resist their pressure. After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, my mind racing through possibilities. Sophia was in danger. The crime scene was being compromised, and I was 3,000 miles away playing housewife while Connor built his defense strategy. That's when Agent Chen's earlier suggestion crystallized into a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. 2 days later, I walked into Connor's home office carrying coffee and wearing the expression of confused concern I'd perfected over the past months. Connor, I've been thinking about something and I hope you won't be angry, but I need to ask you about it. He looked up from his computer with the patient expression he used when he thought I was about to say something particularly naive. Of course, darling. What's troubling you? It's about Italy. About that sweet old woman at the hotel who took care of me. I set his coffee down and perched on the edge of his desk, playing the role of impulsive wife. I keep thinking about how isolated she was, how hard it must be to maintain that big property alone. Connor's expression sharpened slightly, but his voice remained casual. I see. And? Well, I was wondering, with all your international business connections, do you think there might be investment opportunities in Italian real estate? Maybe we could help her while also making a smart financial decision? The silence stretched long enough that I began to worry I'd overplayed my hand. But then Connor's face relaxed into the indulgent smile he used when he thought I was being charmingly naive about business matters. Eva, sweetheart, international real estate investment is incredibly complex. Currency fluctuations, Italian property, laws, tax implications. It's not the kind of thing you just decide to do because you feel sorry for someone. I know it's complicated, I persisted, allowing a note of hurt to enter my voice. But couldn't you at least look into it? You're always talking about diversifying investments, and that hotel has such beautiful bones. With the right renovation, it could be magnificent. I watched Connor process this request, seeing the exact moment when he recognized an opportunity. If he could convince me to invest in the hotel, using money that would ultimately be traced back to his criminal proceeds, he could gain control of the property while making me an unwitting accomplice in his cover-up. You know what? He said slowly, his voice taking on the thoughtful tone he used when a new scheme was forming. Maybe you're onto something. It might be worth having Allen and Clark take a look at the numbers. They have more experience with European investments. Really? I let excitement brighten my voice. You think it could work? We'd need to be very careful about due diligence, Connor warned, already reaching for his phone. Italian property law is notoriously complex. We'd need to send someone over there to evaluate the situation properly. Within a week, Connor had convinced himself that acquiring Hotel Villa Serena was his own brilliant idea. He presented elaborate plans for renovating the property into a luxury boutique hotel, complete with financial projections showing potential, returns on investment. Allen and Clark, initially skeptical, were won over when Connor explained how owning the property would give them permanent control over their former crime scene. It's actually quite genius, Allen admitted during one of their planning sessions, which I now attended as the emotional investor, whose sentimental attachment to the hotel had inspired the project. We eliminate any potential evidence issues, while creating a legitimate business that could actually be profitable. What none of them realized was that Agent Chen and I had choreographed this entire scenario. Every meeting I attended was recorded. Every financial document Connor prepared for the Italian investment was copied and forwarded to federal investigators. Most importantly, every step they took toward acquiring the hotel provided additional evidence of their awareness that the property contained incriminating materials. The real breakthrough came when Connor decided he needed to travel to Italy, personally to finalize the hotel purchase. I want you to come with me, he announced over dinner one evening. This was your idea after all. You should be there for the closing. Are you sure? I asked, though my heart was racing with anticipation. I don't want to get in the way of the business negotiations. Nonsense. Besides, I think Signora Benedetti trusts you. Your presence might help smooth any remaining concern she has about the sale. What Connor didn't know was that Sophia and I had been in regular contact throughout the acquisition process, coordinating our responses to ensure the sale moved forward exactly as the FBI wanted. Every contract Connor signed, every bank transfer he authorized, every conversation he had about cleaning up loose ends was being documented by investigators on both sides of the Atlantic. As our departure date approached, I found myself feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about working as part of a team toward a common goal. Agent Chen, Sophia, the Italian financial police, even Marcus Weber from my old firm, we'd all become collaborators in a complex operation that required each person to play their role perfectly. You've really found your calling, Agent Chen told me during our final briefing before the trip. I meant what I said about considering a career with the Bureau. You have natural instincts for this work. For the first time since Connor had abandoned me on that mountain road, I wasn't just surviving or even thriving, I was leading. The helpless wife he'd discarded had become the architect of his downfall, building a case so comprehensive that his conviction was virtually guaranteed. Connor thought he was taking me to Italy to complete his acquisition of the crime scene. In reality, I was taking him there to deliver him directly into the hands of waiting federal agents. The irony wasn't lost on me as we drove up the familiar mountain road toward Hotel Villa Serena 6 months after Connor had abandoned me there. This time, he was the one who was walking into a trap, though his confident commentary about renovation plans and profit margins suggested he had no idea what awaited him. "I still can't believe you spotted this opportunity," he said, one hand on the steering wheel, while the other gestured toward the valley below. "Most people would have seen a rundown hotel in the middle of nowhere. You saw potential." If only he knew how much potential I'd actually seen, and how little of it involved hospitality revenue. Sophia greeted us at the hotel entrance with the perfect performance of an elderly woman grateful for financial salvation. She embraced me warmly, chatted enthusiastically about the renovation plans, and treated Connor with the deferential respect of someone who viewed him as her benefactor rather than her destroyer. "Signora Davis," she said, taking my hands in both of hers, "you cannot imagine how happy I am to see this place have new life. Enrico would be so pleased to know the hotel will be beautiful again." Connor beamed at what he interpreted as confirmation of his business acumen. "We're planning to restore it to its former glory, Signora Benedetti. Perhaps even surpass it." What Connor couldn't see from his position was the slight nod Sophia gave me over his shoulder, the signal that everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The closing was scheduled for the following morning, but Connor insisted on a thorough property inspection first. As we toured the grounds, he pointed out renovation possibilities with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was making a legitimate investment rather than purchasing evidence of his own crimes. "The safe room will need to be completely renovated," he mentioned casually as we passed through the lobby. "Modern guests expect proper storage facilities, not some antiquated vault system." "Of course," I agreed, while mentally noting how his eagerness to eliminate the safe room would look to federal prosecutors. Though it might be interesting to preserve some of the hotel's historical character. "Within reason," Connor replied, smoothly. "But business has to come first." That evening, Alan and Clark arrived for what Connor had described as a celebration dinner to mark the acquisition. The three men toasted their success with expensive wine while discussing future plans that revealed more about their criminal operations than they realized. "Once we own this place outright, we can finally put all those Italian complications behind us," Alan said, raising his glass. "Clean slate moving forward." "Much cleaner," Clark agreed, his usual reserve loosened by alcohol. "No more worrying about uncomfortable questions from property owners who might have noticed too much." I smiled and nodded as though I found their conversation pleasantly mysterious rather than deeply incriminating. Every word was being recorded by the sophisticated listening devices Agent Chen's team had installed throughout the hotel during our planning phase. The next morning brought what Connor believed would be his moment of triumph. The Italian notary, Dottore Martinelli, arrived precisely on schedule with documents transferring ownership of Hotel Villa Serena to a shell company Connor had established for the purchase. "This is quite exciting," I said as we gathered around the antique table, in what had been the hotel's formal dining room. "Our first international property investment." "The first of many, I hope," Connor replied, signing documents with the confidence of someone who believed he was securing his future rather than sealing his fate. The signing ceremony proceeded flawlessly, with Connor, Allen, and Clark each affixing their signatures to documents that transferred not just property ownership, but legal responsibility for everything that had occurred on the premises. They were so focused on gaining control of potential evidence that they failed to consider how their eagerness to acquire the specific location of their crimes would appear to investigators. "Congratulations, Signor Davis," Dottore Martinelli said formally as the final documents were notarized. "You are now the proud owner of Hotel Villa Serena." "Thank you," Connor replied, shaking hands with the notary. "I look forward to bringing this property back to its full potential." What he didn't notice was the brief exchange of glances between Dottore Martinelli and Sophia, or the way both of them checked their watches as if timing was somehow important. 2. Exactly 11:30 a.m., as Connor was examining his copies of the ownership documents, the sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the hotel's gravel parking lot drew everyone's attention to the windows. Expecting someone else? Alan asked, his voice carrying the first note of unease I'd heard from him all morning. No, Connor replied slowly, moving toward the window. The closing was supposed to be private. Through the glass, we could see 3 unmarked sedans and what appeared to be a van equipped with sophisticated communications equipment. Men and women in dark suits were emerging from the vehicles, their movements coordinated with the precision of a well-rehearsed operation. Connor, I said quietly, allowing carefully controlled concern to color my voice. Who are those people? But Connor couldn't answer because Agent Sydney Chen was already walking through the hotel's front entrance, her FBI credentials clearly visible and her expression professionally neutral. Gentlemen, she announced to the room, I'm Special Agent Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, tax evasion, and wire fraud. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Alan's wine glass slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers and shattering against the stone floor. Connor's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, denial, and finally a dawning horror as he began to understand what had happened. His eyes found mine across the room, and I saw the exact moment when he realized that his helpless, abandoned wife had orchestrated his downfall. Eva, he whispered, his voice carrying a note of betrayal that would have been laughable if it wasn't so perfectly predictable. Hello, Connor, I replied calmly. I told you I'd learned a lot during my time at this hotel. I just didn't mention that one of the things I learned was how to build a federal case. As the FBI agents moved forward with handcuffs, reading rights, and outlining charges, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of work well done. For months, I'd been building toward this moment, and seeing it executed flawlessly was better than any revenge fantasy I could have imagined. Connor had taught me to be small, quiet, and compliant, but he'd forgotten the most important lesson of all. Never underestimate someone you've given nothing left to lose. In the chaos that followed the arrests, I found myself in the unexpected position of being the only person in the room who wasn't, either in handcuffs or frantically trying to explain their involvement to federal agents. Agent Chen approached me with something that might have been a smile if FBI agents were allowed to express satisfaction at successful operations. Mrs. Davis, or should I say Special Consultant Davis, she said quietly, outstanding work. The coordination between your intelligence gathering and our international operation was flawless. Connor, who was being read his rights by Agent Martinez, turned sharply at her words. Special Consultant? Ava, what the hell is she talking about? I looked at my soon-to-be ex-husband with the calm confidence of someone who'd finally found her true calling. I'm talking about the fact that for the past 6 months, I've been working with the FBI to document your criminal operations. Every dinner conversation, every business meeting I attended, every document you left carelessly on your desk, all of it was being recorded and analyzed by federal investigators. Alan's face had gone pale as the implications sank in. You mean she's been wearing a wire this entire time? Not just wearing one, Agent Chen clarified. Mrs. Davis helped us design a comprehensive surveillance operation that included audio, monitoring, document photography, and financial transaction tracking. Her professional background made her uniquely qualified to identify and preserve evidence that might have taken us years to uncover through traditional investigation methods. Clark, who had remained silent since the agents arrived, finally spoke. How long have you known? I've suspected Connor was involved in financial crimes for months, I replied honestly. But I confirmed it the night you abandoned me here. I found your complete operation. The safe room, the computer equipment, the filing cabinets full of incriminating documents. You were so confident that I was just a helpless housewife that you never bothered to secure evidence from someone with a background in financial investigation. But you couldn't have... Connor's voice trailed off as he processed what I was telling him. You don't have the skills to analyze complex financial records, To identify money laundering patterns? To build a comprehensive case file? I interrupted. Connor, I was one of the youngest senior analysts at Peterson and Associates before. You convinced me to give up my career. Did you really think those skills just disappeared because I started planning dinner parties instead of tracking offshore accounts? Agent Chen stepped forward, addressing the three men with professional authority. What your ex-wife, has told you is accurate. The evidence she's provided over the past 6 months is sufficient to support federal charges carrying sentences of 25 to 40 years each. The Italian authorities have similar charges pending, and the Swiss government has frozen accounts totaling over $37 million. Sophia, who had been quietly observing from the corner, approached me with tears in her eyes. Eva, cara mia, I cannot believe what you have accomplished. When I first found you collapsed in my olive grove, I thought I was helping a lost tourist. I had no idea I was rescuing someone who would save my home and bring justice to men who had been using it for criminal purposes. Her words reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten in the excitement of seeing Connor arrested. Sophia, what happens to the hotel now? Connor signed the ownership papers, but obviously he was using criminal proceeds. Actually, Agent Chen said, that's been arranged. The property purchase will be invalidated as part of the criminal asset forfeiture process. But Mrs. Davis, your cooperation with this investigation has earned you certain considerations from the Department of Justice. She handed me an envelope marked with official FBI letterhead. Inside, you'll find a formal offer to join the Bureau as a special agent with immediate assignment to our Financial Crimes Unit. Your performance over the past 6 months has been exceptional. You've shown analytical skills, operational instincts, and the kind of moral courage we look for in federal law enforcement. I stared at the envelope, hardly believing what I was hearing. 6 months ago, I'd been an abandoned wife with no career, no independent income, and no clear future. Now I was being offered a position with one of the most prestigious law enforcement agencies in the world. Additionally, Agent Chen continued, the Justice Department has approved a substantial reward payment for your cooperation in this case. The amount should be sufficient to purchase Hotel Villa Serena outright, if you're interested in continuing your partnership with Signora Benedetti. Sophia gasped, her hands covering her mouth in amazement. You mean you could actually buy the hotel? We could restore it together? But this time legitimately, I said, feeling pieces of a new life falling into place with perfect clarity. No hidden safe rooms, no criminal proceeds, no money laundering operations, just an honest business built on legitimate investment. Connor, who had been listening to this exchange with growing disbelief, finally exploded. This is insane! Eva, you can't seriously be considering throwing away our life together for some FBI fantasy and a rundown hotel in the mountains. I turned to face him, seeing clearly for the first time the man I'd been married to for 8 years. Without the filter of love, loyalty, or learned helplessness, Connor looked exactly like what he was, a criminal who'd used emotional manipulation to control someone he'd considered intellectually inferior. Our life together, I repeated. Connor, our life together was built on lies, criminal money, and your systematic effort to make me small enough that I wouldn't threaten your operations. You didn't abandon me on this mountain because you were angry about a fight. You abandoned me because you were afraid of what I might discover if I kept asking questions. That's not... I never meant... Connor struggled to find words that could somehow reframe 8 years of emotional manipulation and financial crime. You're right, I said quietly. You never meant for me to discover the truth. You never meant for me to remember that I was capable of analytical thinking. You never meant for me to realize that the professional skills you dismissed as a little consulting job were exactly what federal investigators needed to build an unbeatable case against you. Agent Martinez, who had been processing Alan's arrest, looked up from his paperwork. Mrs. Davis, we need to transport the suspects for booking and initial arraignment. Are you comfortable remaining here, or would you prefer protective custody? Until the immediate investigation is complete? I looked around the hotel lobby where this entire journey had begun. At Sophia, who'd become the mentor and friend Connor had never allowed me to have. At Agent Chen, who'd shown me professional respect I'd forgotten I deserved. At the stone walls that had sheltered both criminal activity and the investigation that had brought it to justice. I'm staying here, I said firmly. This is where I belong now. As the FBI agents led Connor, Allen, and Clark toward their waiting vehicles, I felt the weight of 8 years of diminishment lifting from my shoulders. I wasn't just free of a criminal husband. I was free to become the person I'd always been capable of being. 2 weeks after the arrests, I was reviewing architectural plans for the hotel renovation when Agent Chen called with news that made my blood run cold. Eva, I need to inform you that Connor, Allen, and Clark have been released on bail pending trial, she said without preamble. Their defense attorneys argued successfully that they're not flight risks given their business ties to the United States. My hand tightened on the phone. How is that possible? They were caught with overwhelming evidence of international money laundering. Their lawyers are very good, and they posted substantial bail, ironically using assets we haven't yet been able to prove our criminal proceeds. More importantly, Connor's attorney has filed motions claiming that you entrapped him through emotional manipulation and that any evidence gathered through your cooperation should be inadmissible. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd systematically manipulated me for years was now claiming that I had manipulated him. What does that mean for the case? It means we need to be prepared for them to contact you directly. They can't legally threaten or intimidate you, but they can try to convince you to recant your testimony or change your story. Eva, I want you to understand. These men are facing decades in prison. They have every incentive to try to discredit you. That evening, as I worked with Sophia on plans for converting the former safe room into a proper hotel office, my phone rang. Connor's number appeared on the screen, and for a moment I hesitated before answering. Hello, Connor. Eva. His voice was different, strained, lacking the confident authority I'd grown accustomed to. We need to talk. I don't think that's a good idea. You should be communicating through your attorney. Please. The word came out broken, desperate. Just 5 minutes. I'm not asking you to change anything or do anything illegal. I need to understand how we got here. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a small cafe in the village below the hotel. Sophia insisted on accompanying me, positioning herself at a nearby table with clear sight lines and her cell phone ready to call the authorities if needed. Connor looked terrible. His usually immaculate appearance was rumpled, his face drawn with stress and sleepless nights. When he stood to greet me, his movements carried none of their former confidence. You look good, he said as I sat across from him. Different, stronger. Maybe? I am stronger, I replied simply. What did you want to talk about? I've been trying to understand when everything went wrong between us. Connor's hands wrapped around his coffee cup like he was seeking warmth. Was it all an act? The whole marriage? Did you ever actually love me? Or were you always planning something like this? The question revealed so much about his fundamental inability to understand what he'd done. Even now, facing federal prison, he couldn't grasp that his actions had consequences beyond his own experience. Connor, I loved you completely for 8 years. I gave up my career, my friends, my independence because I believed in what we were building together. The only reason I'm sitting here as your adversary instead of your partner is because you chose criminal activity over our marriage. Criminal activity? His voice rose slightly, then dropped as he noticed other cafe patrons, turning to look. Eva, everything I did was to build a better life for us. The consulting business, the international investments. I was securing our future. You were stealing money and hiding it from the government. You were helping other people evade taxes while skimming profits for yourself. That's not building a future, Connor. That's destroying it. But you didn't have to. He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. Why didn't you just talk to me? If you had concerns about the business, why didn't you come to me instead of going to the FBI? The question was so fundamentally disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. Connor, I tried to ask you about your business for months. Every time I showed interest or asked questions, you dismissed me as being too emotional, too naive, too intellectually limited to understand. You literally abandoned me on a mountain road because I asked uncomfortable questions. That was a mistake, he said quickly. I was drunk. I was angry. I made a terrible decision in the moment. But Ava, that doesn't justify destroying everything. We built together. What we built together was built on lies, I said firmly. Our house, our cars, our lifestyle, all of it was purchased with stolen money. I can't unknow that, Connor. I can't pretend our marriage was real when it was funded by criminal activity. Connor leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone I remembered from our early dating days. But it doesn't have to end this way. My lawyers think they can get the charges reduced, maybe even dismissed on procedural grounds. We could start over, build something legitimate this time. Start over, I repeated incredulously. Connor, you committed serious federal crimes. You're facing 25 years in prison. There is no starting over. There could be, if you were willing to. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If you were willing to adjust your testimony slightly. If you could acknowledge that maybe you misunderstood some of what you saw, that maybe your emotional state after our fight affected your interpretation of the documents. And there it was. The real reason for this meeting. Connor wasn't seeking reconciliation or understanding. He was trying to manipulate me into sabotaging the federal case against him. You want me to lie under oath, I said flatly. I want you to consider that maybe your initial interpretation was influenced by anger and hurt feelings. Maybe what looked like criminal activity was actually legitimate business that you didn't fully understand. I studied his face, seeing the calculated desperation behind his apparent vulnerability. This was Connor at his most dangerous, using emotional manipulation disguised as romantic reconciliation to serve his own interests. Connor, I said quietly, do you remember what you told Alan and Clark when you thought I was out of earshot? You said that getting rid of me was the best business decision you'd ever made. You said I was dead weight you'd been carrying out of misplaced loyalty. His face went pale as he realized I'd overheard more than he'd known. You didn't abandon me because you were drunk or angry, I continued. You abandoned me because you thought I was a threat to your criminal operation. And you were right. I was. I am. Eva, please. The woman you married, the one who would have believed your explanations and made excuses for your behavior, is gone. You killed her when you drove away laughing on that mountain road. The woman sitting here now is someone you never bothered to know, someone who's capable of analytical thinking, moral courage, and independent action. I stood to leave, but Connor grabbed my wrist with desperate strength. You're destroying both. Our lives for what? Some sense of moral superiority? Some fantasy about being a federal agent? I looked down at his hand on my wrist, the same controlling grip he'd used countless times to manage my behavior, and felt nothing but pity. I'm not destroying our lives, Connor. I'm choosing to build a life worth living. The difference is, I'm finally old enough to tell the difference. 3 days after my confrontation with Connor, I was awakened at dawn by the sound of car engines in the hotel's parking lot. Through my bedroom window, I could see Connor's Mercedes alongside Alan's BMW and Clark's Audi. All 3 men had returned to Hotel Villa Serena together. I called Agent Chen immediately, but her phone went to voicemail. It was 6 a.m. local time, meaning it was midnight in Boston. I was on my own until federal agents could respond to whatever was about to happen. Sophia met me in the hallway, her face grim with determination. They have been here for 20 minutes, walking around the property, examining the buildings. Eva, I think they are planning something. The front door of the hotel opened without ceremony, and Connor walked in as if he still owned the place. Alan and Clark flanked him, their expressions harder than I'd ever seen them. Eva, Connor said, his voice carrying none of the desperate pleading from our cafe meeting. We need to have a final conversation. You're trespassing, I replied, standing straighter. This property belongs to Sophia, and you have no legal right to be here. Actually, Alan said, pulling out a folder, we have these. He spread documents. Across the reception desk, legal papers bearing official stamps and signatures. Injunctions freezing all assets pending resolution of our criminal case. That includes this hotel, which was purchased with funds the government claims are criminal proceeds. My heart sank as I recognized what they'd accomplished. Their lawyers had found a way to tie up the property in legal proceedings, preventing Sophia from selling it to me or anyone else until the criminal case was resolved. Very clever, I admitted, but it doesn't change anything about the charges against you. Actually, it changes everything, Clark said quietly. He'd been the most reserved of the three, but now his voice carried a cold certainty that chilled me. Because if this property is tied up in federal asset forfeiture proceedings, any evidence found here becomes questionable. Chain of custody issues, improper seizure procedures, there are numerous grounds for having everything thrown out. Connor stepped closer, his familiar confident demeanor returning now that he felt he held the advantage. Eva, you've played this game very well, but you made one crucial mistake. You assumed that just because you understood financial crimes, you understood criminal law. Our attorneys have been very busy, Alan added with his old malicious smile. Turns out there are significant procedural problems with how the FBI handled this investigation, using a civilian informant without proper oversight, conducting surveillance on private property without clear warrants, coordinating with foreign governments without following proper protocols. I felt the first stirrings of real fear as I understood what they were telling me. They weren't just fighting the criminal charges. They were systematically dismantling the case I'd helped build. But the most beautiful part, Connor continued, is that all of this could be resolved very simply. The government's case depends entirely on your testimony and cooperation. Without that, you want me to refuse to testify, I said. I want you to consider the consequences of continuing down this path, Connor replied smoothly. Criminal trials can take years, appeals can take even longer. During all that time, every asset connected to this case, including this hotel, including any reward money you might have been promised, remains frozen. Sophia stepped forward then, her aged voice carrying surprising strength. You think you can frighten us with legal papers and threats? Young man, I have lived through fascists and communists and corrupt politicians. You are nothing but common criminals in expensive suits. Clark turned toward her with calculated menace. Signora Benedetti, at your age, do you really want to spend your remaining years fighting legal battles you can't possibly afford? We're offering you a way out. Take it. But instead of intimidation, I felt something entirely different rising in my chest. Pure, focused anger. These men thought they could walk back into the place where they'd committed crimes, threaten an elderly woman who'd shown me kindness, and manipulate me into destroying the case I'd spent months building. They'd forgotten the most important lesson from their original mistake. Never underestimate someone who's already lost everything and has nothing left to fear. Connor, I said quietly, you're absolutely right about one thing. I did make a crucial mistake in this whole process. His expression shifted to wary satisfaction. Oh? I was still thinking like your wife instead of like a federal investigator. I was still trying to minimize the damage instead of maximizing the justice. Before any of them could respond, I pulled out my phone and hit speed dial for a number I'd memorized weeks ago. Agent Chen, this is Eva. They're all here at the hotel right now, attempting to obstruct justice and intimidate witnesses. I think it's time to activate that arrest warrant you've been holding in reserve. The silence that followed my phone call was broken only by the sound of Connor's sharp intake of breath as he realized what I'd just done. Eva, hang up the phone, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. You don't understand what you're— I understand perfectly. I interrupted, keeping Agent Chen on the line. I understand that you just violated the terms of your bail by coming here to intimidate witnesses. I understand that you're attempting to obstruct a federal investigation, and I understand that you still think I'm stupid enough to be manipulated by threats and legal maneuvering. Alan stepped forward aggressively. You little— I wouldn't finish that sentence if I were you, I said calmly. Agent Chen can hear every word you're saying, and threatening a federal witness carries its own criminal penalties. Through the phone, I could hear Agent Chen coordinating with other agents. Eva, Italian authorities are en route to your location. Keep them talking for another 10 minutes. 10 minutes, I said aloud, watching all three men's faces go pale as they understood that reinforcements were coming. That's exactly how long it took you to abandon me on this mountain road 6 months ago. Fitting, don't you think? Connor's mask of control finally slipped completely. Eva, you're destroying everything. Our marriage, our life together, our future. What marriage? I interrupted. The one where you systematically isolated me from my career and friends? The one where you dismissed every opinion I expressed and every question I asked? The one funded entirely by criminal proceeds? I gave you everything, Connor shouted, his composure cracking. A beautiful home, financial security, social status. You gave me a cage, I replied quietly. A beautiful, expensive cage designed to keep me too comfortable and too dependent to notice that you were building your success on lies and stolen money. Clark, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly moved toward the exit. This is insane. I'm not staying here to be arrested again because Connor can't control his wife. Ex-wife, I corrected. And Clark, you might want to reconsider leaving. The Italian police have a very different approach to suspects who flee the scene of witness. Intimidation. As if summoned by my words, the sound of sirens began echoing through the mountain valley, growing louder as vehicles approached the hotel. Sophia, who had been watching this confrontation with fierce satisfaction, stepped beside me in a gesture of solidarity. Eva, cara mia, you have become exactly the woman Enrico would have hoped to see in this place. Strong, brave, unafraid to fight for what is right. Sophia's right, I said, looking directly at Connor for what I knew would be the last time. The woman you married, the one who would have believed your explanations and protected your secrets, died the moment you drove away laughing 6 months ago. The woman standing here now is someone you never bothered to know, and she's your worst nightmare. The first police vehicles were pulling into the parking lot now, their blue lights flashing against the ancient stone walls of the hotel. Eva, please! Connor made one final, desperate attempt. If you testify against us, you'll be destroying 3 lives. 3 marriages, 3 families. No, I said firmly. You destroyed those lives when you chose to commit crimes instead of building something legitimate. You destroyed those families when you prioritized greed over integrity. I'm just making sure you face the consequences. Agent Chen's voice came through the phone speaker, addressing the room. Gentlemen, you're under arrest for violation of bail conditions, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. Italian officers are entering the building now. As the Guardia di Finanza officers filed into the lobby, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my Peterson and Associates days. The deep satisfaction of a case closed successfully. But more than that, I felt the profound relief of finally becoming the person I was always meant to be. Connor had tried to diminish me into an accessory to his success. Instead, he'd accidentally created the architect of his downfall. The abandoned wife had become a federal agent. The silenced partner had become a star witness. And the woman who'd once defined herself through his achievements had discovered her own formidable power. As they led him away in handcuffs for the second time, Connor looked back at me with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if he still couldn't understand how the helpless woman he'd discarded had transformed into his destroyer. I smiled and gave him a small wave goodbye. After all, I'd learned everything I knew about strategic thinking from watching him manipulate others. I'd just learned to use those skills for justice instead of crime. 6 months later, I stood in the beautifully renovated lobby of Hotel Villa Serena, watching Sophia arrange fresh flowers from our organic garden in crystal vases that caught the afternoon sunlight. The space that had once housed Connor's criminal operation now welcomed guests from around the world who came to experience authentic Tuscan hospitality. The transformation was complete in every way that mattered. Where there had once been a secret, safe room filled with evidence of financial crimes, we now had a wine cellar stocked with bottles from local vineyards. The computer equipment used for money laundering had been replaced by a state-of-the-art kitchen where Sophia taught cooking classes to delighted visitors. "Agent Davis," Sophia called out, using my new title with obvious pride. "Your colleague from the FBI has arrived." Agent Chen emerged from the stone staircase leading to our guest rooms, her professional demeanor softened by what appeared to be a genuine vacation smile. She was taking a week's leave before returning to Boston, and I'd insisted she spend it with us. "The conviction was unanimous on all counts," she reported, settling into one of the comfortable chairs we'd arranged around the ancient fireplace. "Connor received 32 years, Alan 28, Clark 25. The Swiss accounts have been fully recovered, and the Italian government has formally thanked the Bureau for our cooperation in their anti-corruption efforts." I felt a deep sense of completion hearing those numbers. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been served comprehensively, with sentences that reflected the serious nature of their crimes. "And the hotel?" Agent Chen asked, looking around at our restored surroundings. "Completely legitimate now," I replied with satisfaction. "The Justice Department's reward payment covered the purchase price plus renovations. Sophia and I are equal partners in a business that's actually profitable. Through honest means, imagine that. What about you personally? Any regrets about the path you chose?" I considered the question seriously. 8 months ago, I'd been a dependent wife with no career, no independence, and no clear sense of my own identity. Now I was a federal agent, specializing in international financial crimes, co-owner of a successful boutique hotel, and someone who'd helped bring dangerous criminals to justice. "The only regret I have," I said finally, "is that it took Connor abandoning me to discover who I really was. But maybe that's how transformation always works. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you actually needed." Sophia joined us with espresso and her famous biscotti, her eyes twinkling with the contentment of someone whose life had found perfect purpose. "Eva, cara mia, you saved not just this hotel but yourself. That is the greatest victory of all." As the sun set over the Tuscan hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, I realized that Connor had been right about one thing. My time at this hotel had taught me exactly how capable I was of handling myself without anyone's protection or permission. He just never imagined I'd use those capabilities against him. The woman he'd abandoned on this mountain. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.